First things first, videography basics. The baseline of skills that you're going to need to know. What are the fundamentals that you need to know to get going in videography? So we're going to start dead simple with exposure, composition, and then how to make your camera your bitch.
Yeah, bitch.
So composition, what is it? Put very simply, composition is what is in your frame, what is on the screen at any given point in time. Be that an actor, be that a prop, be that a setting or the scenery. Your composition creates whatever emotion or whatever story you're trying to tell. So be that an interview that you want to have clean and corporate, you might have it on what's called the rule of thirds. So say you have a scene where you want to give the impression that somebody's been intimidated or they're weak or they're small. You'll often see that from a top-down perspective. In contrast, if you want to give the illusion of grandeur and majesticness and power, you'd often see a camera faced from a downward perspective facing upwards. There's many other different ways that you can frame your composition, and that's a whole video in itself. The next thing, exposure. Put very simply, exposure is how bright the bright things are in your image and how dark the dark things are in your image. That simple rule, you also need to really understand in tandem with operating a camera, which I'll come on to in just a second. But put simply, exposure is what are the lightest parts of your image, what are the darkest parts of your image, and making sure that when you shoot something on your camera, you can see what's in the highlights, the bright bits, and what's in the dark bits. So the next thing that you need to know about are the basics of operating a camera. We're going to cover 4 key areas. Number 1, frame rate. Number 2, shutter speed. Number 3, aperture. And then number 4, finally, ISO. And these really correlate very closely to getting that exposure right. So what are they? Let's start with frame rates. A frame rate is how many frames or still images are captured within 1 single second. So a typical video will be shot in 24 frames a second, which means that there are 24 photos within 1 second, and that's what creates the movement in it. Depending on how high your frame rate is, that will give you more flexibility to speed up or slow down the image. So if you have 120 frames or 240 frames, or if you're on a Hollywood camera and there's 1,000 frames captured within 1 second, that means that there's more images that can be slowed down, which means you can create a better and smoother slow motion for your video. Next up, shutter speed. So shutter speed, or exposure time, is the length of time when the film or digital sensor inside a camera is exposed to light. Shutter speed will affect the amount of motion blur that is captured within a video. This can give some abnormal effects if the shutter speed is too high, because it gives the impression that things are a little bit too sharp. It doesn't have blur, and that's not how our eyes see the world. Everything in a camera that we're trying to achieve is making it as easy to view on the eyes as possible, and that means making it like what the eyes see. I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of shutter speed, but one thing as a filmmaker you must know is the 180-degree shutter rule. And what that states is to mimic the same way that the human eye experiences movement in real life, the shutter speed should be set to double your frame rate. So say for example you had a frame rate at 24 frames, your shutter speed needs to be 48. Same again if it's 60, 120, 120, 240, and so on. Okay, so now that you've got your frame rate set correctly and you've got your shutter speed set to double your frame rate so the human eye is going to see it and enjoy it and there's not going to be any weirdness when you watch it, the next thing you need to think about is your aperture. Now your aperture really relates closely to what we spoke about earlier with exposure. Okay, so aperture, how do we define it? Aperture is said to be the opening in a lens through which light passes to enter the camera. So what does that mean? Put simply, the aperture is the amount of light that enters into your camera. And that will affect 2 things, the exposure and the focus. Now the exposure we spoke about earlier. Now that is the highlights and the dark parts of your image. Now the faster your aperture, the smaller the number will be. And that means that the camera and the lens is letting in more light. The more light that's in there, the brighter parts of the image will be, and the darker parts of the image will be. So you will adjust your f-stop from anything typically between 1.4 all the way up to 10, depending on how much light you need to take out of that image. The other thing to bear in mind is the aperture is one of the key drivers in the focus and bokeh. The lower the aperture, the less things will be in focus in your frame. So high, many things will be in focus and your image will be slightly darker. Lower, a specific thing will be in focus and the image will be much lighter. Now the final thing I'm going to speak to you about on camera basics is your ISO or ISO. Your ISO, put simply, is artificial light that your camera can add into a scene. Now, when will you use this? So ISO is there to add artificial light into a scene to compensate when there's too much dark in a given frame. So rooting back to when we spoke earlier, imagine that you have your aperture set really high, so you have a lot of things in focus. Because you might be shooting a landscape, say, and you want to get the entire landscape in the shot. When you get the whole landscape in the shot and you've cranked up your aperture really high, the image is going to be dark. Now the ISO is there to correct the darkness that is put into place because your aperture is too high. Now there's pros and cons. ISO is great for situations where you are in low light and you need that extra bump. But in filmmaking, it's often looked at as something you should use as a last resort. When you start to increase the volume of ISO in your image, it means that you start to introduce grain and noise into it. And that makes your videos look cheap and nasty. So as a rule of thumb, only use your ISO as a last resort if you absolutely need to correct a dark image, and only use it if you really need to use it at the minimum amount of level that you need to use it at. If you enjoyed the video and you found it of some value and you like what this whole channel's about, you like what it is, just that subscribe button. It's about here, I reckon, right there. Just hit it. Be grateful. I'd be really grateful.